Yes, thank you for having me at the Food and Pharma lecture series. We really appreciate having the opportunity to come here and talk to you a bit about the Green Labs Austria initiative. And we also want to thank Judith Rollinger for inviting us specifically. And so we want to tell you kind of what we've been up to over the last year and what we're hoping to do. And if I had to summarize Green Labs Austria in 30 seconds, I think I would say that it's an initiative that aims to connect Austrian and international laboratories that share the vision of a more sustainable research. So that's a very, very broad description. And of course, that brings about a lot of questions with it. And I'm hoping to answer some of those questions during the duration of this seminar talk. So to give you an idea of some of the things that I would like to cover with you all, I'd like to start out as an introduction to kind of say why we think that Green Labs Austria is important and why we think it fills a need within Austria. We also want to talk about what we've been doing the last year and some of the actions that we have been taking to make labs more sustainable and help facilitate that process. We would then move on to how we could see this moving forward and what we have in mind for the future. And then to conclude, we'll kind of wrap it all up and how we really want to create an impact and hopefully how you guys can be involved with that if you so choose. So to get started with the introduction, the first thing we want to answer is why. Why do we need an initiative like Green Labs Austria? And to answer that question, I think we need to think about where we are at in a global context. And so as I think almost all of you are probably aware, we're facing a lot of environmental issues at the moment. So if you type this into Google, you'll come up with all sorts of things. We have plastic in the oceans, plastic on the beaches. We have an increase in global warming over the past few years. This is then, of course, fueling fires in places like California, Portugal, Australia. And of course, the increase in carbon dioxide is also a big concern. And I think as a society, we're really starting to come to terms with these issues. And I think a lot of people are aware of the impacts that we have on the environment. However, I think what is less intuitive is what the environmental impact is of laboratories. And even to those of us who work consistently in laboratories, this is not always extremely obvious. And so a couple questions we can start to ask about what the impact of laboratories is first of all, how much energy do laboratories use? And to get at this question, we did some background research and we were actually able to find some information from the environmental report of the University of Vienna from 2014. And so to give you an idea what we're looking at here, they assessed a lot of the different buildings on campus to see how much energy these buildings actually use within a given year. And so in this case, it would be specifically 2014. And this is measured in megawatts per hour. But as you can see, Altenstrasse, which encompasses UZ-A1 and UZ-A2, so I think this would be the department I come from, as well as the pharmacology department, if I'm not mistaken, consumes a lot of energy. And of course, you can see in comparison to some of the other university buildings here. Now, this isn't a totally fair comparison because Altenstrasse also has a lot more square footage than a lot of the other buildings. But if we normalize for that, which is what we have in the bottom graph here, we can see that it still makes up for a huge chunk of the energy consumption from the University of Vienna. And I'm not familiar with all of these buildings, but I can say with some certainty that at Altenstrasse, as well as at Dr. Borgasse, these are some of the locations where we have the most laboratories functioning. And so it's a safe conclusion to say that the laboratory activity is contributing to this huge consumption of energy. Now, to put this in a little more concrete terms to make it less abstract, we can also compare this to what a normal flat would be in Vienna. So this is information taken from a study that was done in association with the Technical University in Vienna. And as a comparison, a typical 90 to 120 meter squared flat in Vienna would use approximately 6 megawatts per hour. And that is vastly beneath what we see for all of these university buildings. And if we go even further and normalize that per square footage, we can see that the difference is still very, very stark. And so this is pretty convincing evidence that we do have to think about energy consumption even at the university. Another big question that we can ask is how much do laboratories produce when it comes to waste? Now, a very specific question to this would be, what is our plastic consumption? And this is a study that was published in Nature that came out of the University of Exeter out of the UK. But they determined that out of 280 bench scientists, they generated approximately 267 tons of plastic in 2014. And they went on to say that this is the equivalent of about 5.7 million empty 2-liter plastic bottles. Now, this is a massive amount of plastic for one department. And if you begin to extrapolate those values and think about not only this one department, but the whole university and then the universities globally, you can imagine that these numbers are going to add up very, very rapidly. So again, to kind of get some context as to how this compares to a typical lab, we at Green Labs Austria put together this average resource usage per microbiology lab per year. And we did this in order to compare it to what would be a typical Austrian household. So each green house figure that you see here would represent a household in Austria. And when it comes to plastic, and this is based on our internal data that we have, we would create about, I don't know how many, 15 houses worth of plastic in a year. And comparing that to energy, and this information is from the Boku, we can see once again that this is a huge amount compared to your typical Austrian household. And so this kind of brings us to the question of, if universities are consuming all of these resources, what are they doing about it? And one way we like to put that is, how Greta are the Austrian universities? And what we mean by that is, when we look at the universities and we go to their web pages, how obvious is it that they are trying to make a difference when it comes to sustainability? So 2 of our members tried to evaluate this, and what we did was we went to all of the different web pages for various universities in Austria, and we tried to identify different things we could find on their website that would indicate that they are interested in caring about sustainability. And so we have several different areas here that we would give them green points for. So for example, if we could find evidence of a sustainability report, that would warrant some green points. If we could find evidence that they have an intern who is devoted to working on sustainability at the university, we would give them some more points. If they have cooperations that promote sustainability, and if they mention sustainability on their landing page. So these were kind of the criteria that we were looking for. And the distribution that we get looks something like this. And so you can see at the very top here, we have the Boku here in Vienna. And so they seem to be putting a lot of effort into thinking about how they can work more sustainably. Right behind them is the University in Graz, and the University of Vienna falls somewhere in the middle here. And so this is interesting data to look at, but another thing that really struck us when we were going through all of these different web pages is that although some of these universities are really pushing towards a whole sustainability for the university, what we're really missing is initiatives that really focus on what laboratories can do, because this is where a lot of this energy and plastic come from. And so these are the kinds of initiatives that you would find in other places like the US, the UK, Canada, that really focus on supporting labs in their goal to be more sustainable. And to our knowledge, there's not a strong presence of that in Austria. And so this is something that we wanted to provide, and a need that we wanted to fill. And so this kind of brings us back as to why we think that Green Labs Austria is important, and why we think that it has a place in Austria, and particularly within the university system. So now that we've kind of covered the why, the next thing we really want to show you is, what are we doing? So we see that there's a problem, we see that there's an issue, but what are some actions that we can take now that would help in addressing these problems? And to really answer this question about what we are doing, we have to go all the way back to the beginning and give you some information about how we got started as a group at Green Labs Austria. So originally, this was a collection of PhD students and postdocs, and we ended up being from 3 different lab groups. And we started to meet together to talk about ways that we could become more sustainable. And the reason that we all started meeting was that we shared a common lab space. We shared a lot of equipment, we used the common ordering form, we use a lot of the same bench space, and so it made sense for us to start talking to each other and think about some of these questions. And so, of course, our primary goal here was to identify and implement more sustainable lab practices. However, in the process, we realized that we are accumulating a lot of knowledge, and a lot of research goes into figuring out how to do these processes. And so another thing that we wanted to do is really connect with other labs and share what we have learned, and also try to learn from them and find things that maybe they thought of that hadn't occurred to us. And so this is really what Green Labs Austria came out of. And as we went on through this process, we've of course collected more members and have started working with more labs to try to come up with the best way to move forward with this. So this is all great, but of course we still need to address the question of, how do we actually become more sustainable? And in our discussions that we started about a year ago, we came up with two main topics that we wanted to tackle. And these are directly related to what I discussed in the introduction. And that would be our energy consumption and the consumables that we go through. So the first one that we wanted to tackle was, of course, electricity. So here, the big thing that we focused on was our -80 freezers. Now, as a microbiology lab, we have at least two of these, and they are very important for a lot of the things that we do in terms of keeping samples available for many, many years. However, what is not so well known is that these are extremely energy intensive. And so one -80 freezer, again, takes about the same energy as a 90 to 120 meter squared flat in Vienna. So you can imagine that in an institute or a laboratory, for every -80 that you have, you're contributing an average household's worth of energy by having that. And not to say that we need to get rid of them. I know they're important, but these are just things that are good to be aware of. And so this kind of prompted some questions for us. And one of the first questions was, do freezers really need to operate at -80 degrees? And why is it that they are all operating at -80? Is it just because they can, or would it be possible to maybe increase the temperature a bit? And as a follow-up, if we were to increase the temperature, could we save energy by doing that? And what would the net effects of that be? So to address these questions, we contacted the owner of our freezer, the company that they came from, which would be Thermoscientific, and we asked them for some information, and they were able to get us the Energy Star test results for the -80. And so if we look here, we can see that we have performance testing. And if we zoom in even further, we can also see that they have already calculated what it looks like for -80 and -70 for running these freezers. And the important information is down here, where they do a 24-hour test period and, more importantly, a steady state interval. And you can see pretty easily that going from -80 to -70 causes a pretty large reduction in the amount of energy that you are using. And if you do the crunch the numbers, you come up to about a 31% energy consumption savings. And this is equivalent to about 500 euros per freezer per year. So again, if you think about this in terms of an entire institute or even an entire university, I think you can see how these numbers would start to add up quite dramatically. So after looking at this, we decided, okay, this is something that we want to do. And of course, you can't just go change the temperature on freezers. That's a very bad idea. This requires a lot of coordination and understanding what you have in your freezer to make an informed decision about this process. So we went and looked at our inventory and asked, okay, what do we have? And we are an environmental lab, so we have a lot of things like soil samples, water samples, reactor samples. We even have some samples that have come from the rumen of cattle, extracted RNA, extracted proteins. And probably one of the most important things are our cell lines. So we have cell lines that go back to even our advisor's PhD advisor. And so we're talking about decades worth of research and cell lines that are sometimes encapsulated in these -80 freezers. So it was important for us to really think about, what are the long-term effects of going up to -70? And after looking at all of this and talking with our advisors, we decided that this is probably a change that we could make. And so after deciding this, we made sure to coordinate between everyone that had things in our -80. So our -80 freezer contains items from at least 5 different groups across the university, and we contacted each of them individually and said, this is what we want to do. These are the samples that you have. We don't think that there would be any problem. Are you okay with this? And after talking to all of them and getting the okay from all of the PIs, we were able to make that change. And so at the end of last year, we were very excited for 2 of our -80 freezers to be raised to -70. And although this is a small change, we think it will make a big difference when it comes to thinking about things in the long term. So this is what we really had focused on as in terms of energy consumption, but we also need to think about our consumables. And that was the next big project that we really wanted to tackle. And so this is mainly involving plastic. And so in our lab, which I don't think is very different from many others, we go through a lot of plastic materials. And this covers everything from Falcon tubes, Eppendorf tubes, all of our pipette tips, even most of our chemicals come in these plastic containers. And so this kind of provoked the
Sorry,
question.
Logan.
Yes.
Sorry, may I interrupt you? There are some participants and now you are the host. Could you please invite them or allow them to step in?
Yes, thank you. I just clicked admit all. I thought it would let me know, but.
Can you see that?
Yep. Yep.
Okay,
Perfect.
thanks.
Yes, and maybe just let me know if more come up because I don't think it notifies me as I'm sharing the screen for some reason. But yes, I'll try to keep an eye on that. Okay, so we're worried about plastic and we wanted to know what plastic can be recycled in our lab. And the reason we wanted to ask this is if you look at our storage room, which is where we are all pictured here, you can see behind us that we go through bags and boxes full of these different materials. And so we have Falcon tubes, EPIs, even the pipette racks that we are all holding here. And it seems like there is something we should be able to do with all of this. And so we started investigating how easy is it to begin recycling plastic. And one of the first things that we discovered was that not all plastic is created equally. So for example, different types of plastic are given different types of resin identification codes, and there is about 7 of them that are universally used. And the difference between these different RIC codes is the different polymers that make up this plastic. And based on those polymers, it makes it either more difficult or easier to recycle this type of plastic. And if you look at how easy it is to recycle these different types, what we come up with is there's about 3 that you can typically recycle without much problem. And that ends up being polyethylene, PET, terephthalate, polyethylene high density, and polypropylene. And so knowing this and knowing that these are the types of plastics that we have the potential to recycle, our next big question was, are our own plastic materials made of this type of plastic? So to answer that, we went back to our order list. So we keep an order list that we use every year. And we were able to take that entire order list from 2019 and look at what we buy the most of and try to determine what type of plastic that's made of. And so this is an example of what that looks like. And so this is our consumables for 2019. And you can see starting over here on the left that one of the biggest things that we go through are filter tips. And so following that, we have needle caps. We do a lot of anaerobic microbiology in our lab. And so these needle caps are all plastic, and those are something we go through quite a lot of. We have normal tips. We even go down to paper towels, and the list goes on. And underneath each of these items, we have indicated what they are made of. So if you look at the filter tips here, these are made of polypropylene, or PP. And if you remember from the previous slide, this is a type of plastic that can theoretically be recycled. And so we marked that as green. And so as we go down the list here, we can also see the needle caps. Although it's a different type of plastic, it is also something that should be easy to recycle. It's high density polyethylene. And the vast majority of what we order is actually recyclable. So we marked paper towels and tissues as blue, indicating that it's not plastic, but still can be recycled. And of course, we have some items that would just not be reasonable to recycle at this point. So one unfortunate example of that are nitrile gloves. The material that they are made of just does not make them easy to recycle in the process. Other items that are unfortunately made of polystyrene are also not easy to recycle. And this would include things like cuvettes and certain types of pipettes that we use. But overall, this was very good news for us. This gave us a really strong indication that if we wanted to, we could probably start recycling a lot of plastic out of the lab. So from there, we went to our next question of, okay, we know that we order a lot, but how much do we actually go through in a week? How much plastic waste does one lab actually produce? And so some of the Green Labs Austria members organized this in our group, and we collected all of the waste that we produced in an entire week, and then we sorted it all out, and the results look something like this. And so this is a very interesting picture for many different reasons, but just to give you a brief overview, this is 1 week of waste that came from 12 scientists. And this was actually done during the summer months, and so we were still operating under a limited capacity due to the coronavirus, but nevertheless, we still produce quite a bit of waste here. Now, one thing that I want to point out right off the bat is that we go through a lot of gloves. This is an entire pile of gloves. This is an entire pile of gloves. We also see a lot of paper towels and lots of plastic. But I want to take a detour here and focus on this area up here. So if we zoom in on that, what we are looking at are plastic plate spreaders. And I want to point this out because I think a really important point when thinking about how to deal with plastic waste in the lab is that recycling is great, but if at all possible, it makes much more sense to replace anything that can be replaced and completely remove that plastic from the pipeline. So for example, these plate spreaders are easily replaced by glass plate spreaders. And rather than having to worry about recycling these, we've just completely cut that source of waste from our lab materials. And this is a really good thing that we want to encourage anyone to do if possible. Another item that pops up are these plastic pipettes that are unfortunately made of polystyrene. So at the moment, we can't even recycle these. But again, by collecting all this waste, it made us realize that we are actually going through quite a bit of these. It would make much more sense for us to think about what we are doing and maybe switch to glass pipettes that we can clean and autoclave. And that if we set that up in the lab, this would be a much more efficient process. And so this was the first thing that we realized from some of this waste is where we can do better. The other thing that we can get from all of this is we can start to try to quantify the amount of plastic that we actually produced. And so to do that, we weighed all of these different materials and we get a breakdown that kind of looks like this. And so you can see that paper waste actually made up a huge chunk of all of the produced waste. About 10% of it by weight is also coming from all of our gloves. And 58% of the weight is all plastic. And so that is the equivalent of about 24 kilograms of plastic. And of that 24 kilograms, 11 kilograms were able to be recycled. And so this is about 45.8%. Now, if we extrapolate here a bit, if we think about a lab working at full capacity, in our case, 25 people, this would be the equivalent of about 600 kilograms of plastic per year. And if we can recycle about half of that, being about 300 kilograms, to us, it makes sense to invest the time to go ahead and do that. And so once we saw these numbers, we decided that through Green Labs Austria, we really wanted to develop a recycling pipeline that we can implement into the lab that would make it easy to do this. And so to get started with that, the first thing we had to do was think about separating these plastic materials. So in order to recycle them, of course, they can't be thrown in the normal waste anymore. We would need to collect them in separate containers. And so here, this would break down into a container for polyethylene and a container for polypropylene. And so going from our order list, we already had a good idea of what would go where. So we have needle caps, falcon tube lids, pipette tip racks would all go under polyethylene. Where for polypropylene, we're looking at things more like Eppendorf tubes, pipette tips, not the racks, but the tips themselves, and syringe barrels, etc. So another point I want to make at this figure is that we also need to break it down between autoclave and non-autoclave. And the reason that we do that is because any plastic that has been in contact with biological material needs to be autoclaved before it can be recycled. And one point that people like to bring up and remind us, and it's a good point, is that autoclaving is also a very energy intensive process. However, we are not doing any extra autoclaving by doing this. You have to remember that even if all this plastic was thrown into the normal waste, it would still need to be autoclaved before that happened. So really, we're not adding any autoclaving to this process. We're just separating out the plastic beforehand. And so just keep that in mind when you think about how to go about doing this. So once we know how to separate the plastic, the next big hurdle that we have to tackle is how do we communicate this to the people in the lab? Because it has to be easy for them to understand how they could recycle this plastic and separate it. And so for this, I have to make a point that communication is key, and I cannot stress this enough. And so the way we decided to handle this was to make these informative graphics for our lab, and they are very specific for what our lab members need in order to recycle plastic effectively. So for example, for a container that would, where you could throw HDPE waste, we have this figure here, which is an example of a syringe that we use commonly in anaerobic culturing. And these syringes have green plungers and then clear tubes. And these plungers have to be recycled into the polypropylene. And so we indicate, the plungers go into the HDPE and the tubes themselves have to go to the polypropylene. And so we indicate with these red X's where that needs to go. Now for another lab, this might not make sense, but in our lab where we use a lot that look like this is a very clear indicator for us. Another thing that we go through a lot of is needles, once again, with the anaerobic culturing. And so those needle caps can go into HDPE. And we of course remind people not to put the needles into the recyclable material as well. Over on the polypropylene, we try to illustrate that all of the pipette tips can go into polypropylene, all of our PCR tubes, and even some of these special plastic pipetters that we use can also be thrown into polypropylene. And so this is something that it does take some time to do this, but the better you can tailor this to the people using it, the easier it will be for them to recycle. So once we had this, we implemented this as a benchtop plastic recycling. And so to do this, we found containers that we reused, plastic containers, and we put these figures that we made on them and supplied that, excuse me, at every person's bench top. And so with the figures and with the supplied containers, this made it very easy for them to do this. And now you have to remember that, of course, the first time that you start doing this, it's going to take some thinking about what goes where. So I started using this over the summer. And the first time you really do have to think, okay, where does the pipette tip go? Where does the Eppendorf tube go? But once you start to get the pattern down, it becomes very intuitive and it goes very, very quickly. And we also tried this out with a few people in the lab at first and then expanded it to the whole group. And they were able to come and tell us, okay, this doesn't make sense on your sign. Could you change that? This doesn't make sense to me. And we could make those changes and make this whole process easier. So then, of course, along with the benchtop recycling, we also started putting these larger containers in the lab. And this was actually the product of a great collaboration that we had with the Microbial Oceanography group. And this is something that a connection we made through Green Labs Austria. And they were also looking at recycling plastic, and they said, we've already, started doing this. And we were able to take what we did and what they did and put it all together and make something that worked for both of us. And so this was a great example of the type of connections that we are hoping to make with Green Labs Austria. In addition to that, we've also expanded this process, and we've now collected waste and started looking at plastic with several different groups, not just our own. So here we have the Microbial Oceanography group with a lot of plastic that they collected from the week. We had our second round that we did, and the MOSIS group has also taken part in this. And so we're very excited about this because it really gets people motivated to recycle plastic when you really see all of the waste that you are producing. And this is a great side effect of going through this process, is when people hands-on see what is happening and what could be recycled, it makes a big difference. So this is all great. We've sorted plastic, we've collected it, but this still leaves the one final step, and that is, what do we do with it once we have it? And so here we have to think about recycling options. So not all municipalities have the option to recycle plastic. And so two of the things we wanted to know was, if we collect all of this plastic from our labs, is there anyone who will take it? And importantly, what happens to it when they do take it? And so we started to investigate what is the fate of plastic that gets recycled in Vienna. And so to start out, we tried to find out what happens to all the plastic that goes into these plastic recycling containers that you find around the city. And unfortunately, the answer is not as clear as we were hoping. What we were able to find through a lot of research that our members did was that all of the plastic is handled by ARA, which is the Altstoff Recycling in Austria. And then the plastic is passed on to subcontractors, and the subcontractors are the ones who really deal with the plastic. Now, we've contacted many of these subcontractors, but we can't seem to get a clear answer on what they do with the plastic. And so for us, this is a bit concerning, because we don't want to put all of this effort into this process without knowing what the final destination is. Fortunately, we were able to start working with a company in Vienna known as Stöpselsammeln für einen guten Zweck. And this is run by a guy who collects plastic lids from around Vienna, and he takes these to a recycling plant, and the money he makes off of this, he donates to sick children in Austria. And so we contacted him and asked him, if we start collecting plastic in the lab, would you also be willing to take this source of plastic and recycle it? And so far, he has indicated that he is very willing to do that. And so we are very happy to be working with him on this process. Additionally, he also gave us the information for the plastic recycling company that he works with. And two of our lab members took the initiative, and they were able to visit this plastic recycling company earlier this week. And we are very happy to say that based on this visit, we can definitely say that any plastic that we send to this company will get broken down, and that broken down plastic is used for other plastic materials. And so this was very exciting for us, because this was something that we really wanted to address, and a way we really wanted to close the recycling loop, to say that we for sure know that what we are doing is getting recycled. And now we can definitely say that. And so if we take a step back, we covered a lot of information with the plastic overview. I think when it really comes down to the main steps, of course, we want to replace anything unnecessary in the plastic consumables. And beyond that, if we want to do recycling, what we have to do is first identify the plastic that we find in the lab, set up collection points in the lab to sort out those different types of plastic. And then at the end, of course, do the actual recycling. And so these are two of the big activities that we have really tackled over the last year and that we have put a lot of time and energy into figuring out. And so this has also been great, and we're very happy for this, that we can actually take some actions that are meaningful. But this also brings us to the next question. And we've established why we think Green Labs Austria is necessary, what we are doing, but what does it look like in terms of moving forward? And how do we handle that? So when we were doing this process, as I mentioned before, we learned a lot. And one of the big things of Green Labs Austria is that we really want to share what we learned with other labs. And we want to connect with people who are like-minded. And so we had to think about how we could efficiently communicate this information and all the things that we have been doing. And we decided that one of the best ways to do that is through a website. And so we were able to start this website. You can find us at www.greenlabsaustria.at. And this is an example of what you would see on the homepage if you were to visit that. And so here we kind of give just some general information, but then we also have a lot of connections to links on the website. And one of the most important things that we have on the website is, of course, our members and the people that are working with us and the labs that want to be part of creating a more sustainable lab culture. And so we list those labs on the website. And if you were to click on one of those labs, you'll be taken to a separate page where it gives you a little bit more information about them, what university they're in, who they are and what they're studying, and also why do they want to go green, whether it's because of the research they are doing directly or because it's something that they are passionate about and want to be conscious of. And so we advertise our members here, but we also try to post a lot of articles in the form of blogs to kind of really spread out the information about what we're working on. So if you were to go to the blog post, you'll see the latest articles. We talk about our process for what we did with the -80 freezers, how we got started to recycle plastic in the lab, our analysis of the different web pages for Austrian universities. And we also have some other information about other initiatives that we're working with and things that we're trying to accomplish. And so all in all, what we really want to do is keep spreading this information and also connect with other labs to get more ideas. And an important point here is that we want this to be a bottom-up approach. What we really want to do is work with the PhD students, the postdocs, the technicians that are actively in the lab, because those are who we are, and that's who we know how to communicate with, and that's who we know how to work with. And we can understand the things that they are facing when it comes to recycling. And we think that that's where we can communicate the most efficiently. And so we're hoping that by encouraging this at a individual lab level, we can overcome any resistance there might be from a top-down approach. And so this brings us to the connection point. And to kind of conclude in the last few minutes of this talk, we also want to continue doing this and create an impact. And so creating an impact is something that we're hoping that you'll want to be a part of as well by joining us in Green Labs Austria. And now a question that we get from a lot of people, which is a very valid question, is why does joining Green Labs Austria matter? You know, why can't I just do things that make our lab more sustainable? Why is it important to join this official Verein and really make that connection? And I think the biggest point that I can drive home here is that by joining the organization and being an active part of the Verein, it allows us to really disseminate information effectively. So for example, if another lab or another group has a great idea and wants to join with Green Labs Austria, we can connect that idea to all the groups in a very efficient manner. So a neat example from Professor Rollinger is this idea of using paper that is not the really high quality white paper, but maybe a more economical version for a lot of the everyday printing. And this can save a ton on energy and a ton on the bleaching costs that are involved with using this paper. And if we have people in Green Labs Austria, we can take that idea, we can put it on the website, we can easily send it out to all these different labs and hopefully inspire them to make some of these small changes that we otherwise might not have thought of. I, for one, would never have thought to change the paper and the printers, but this is a small idea that can have a really big impact. And so I think the biggest point that we would like to get across here is that it really comes down to the efficient communication of ideas. Additionally, it's also very beneficial to have the supportive network. It is not easy to make changes in the lab. It's not easy to change how things have always been done. And if we can support other labs in doing this and give them ideas and tell them what worked and what didn't, that is also something that can be very helpful. And finally, coming together under one umbrella organization also gives us a strengthened voice when we start discussing with decision makers. So for example, we were able to meet with the Vice Rectorate's office earlier this year. And the more labs that we have saying, this is something we want to think about and something that we want the university to address, the more pressure that provides in order for these changes to actually happen, not only from a bottom-up approach, but also maybe coming from the administrative side. And of course, there can be lots of other added benefits that we're not even aware of yet. And to really impress upon you the point of this, I really want to remind you that everything that I've shown in this presentation is the collective work of a lot of people from a lot of different groups, and that there is no way that one group could have accomplished all of the research that we've done and all of the changes that we have made. And it was only through this collaborative effort, through building the website, through making the plastic pipeline, for changing the freezers, for looking into what the universities are doing. It was only because of the collaborative effort that any of that was possible. Otherwise, it would just be an insurmountable amount of work. And so the last thing I want to leave you with is, if this is something that you are also interested in doing, I want to tell you maybe how you can join the organization. And so what we really need from you guys would be people who are interested in working with us. So you have to remember that we are students as well. And so it's not something where we would come to your lab and make all the changes for you. What we really need are people who are motivated, who just need some suggestions and some additional help maybe to get started. And that's all we need, and we can really work with you guys from there. And so if a lab wants to join, we just ask for a short description. We want to make sure we show you off on the website, just kind of telling us who you are and why you want to be green. And then to officially join, it just requires a filled out membership form signed by the group leader. And another point I'd like to make is that we really like to remind people, you get out of this what you put into it. And we are not going to be looking over your shoulders to make sure that you're meeting all of these different requirements. It's really how much you want to put into it. And if you've got a lot of ideas and you want to come meet with us weekly and work with us, that is awesome. And we can spread those ideas. We can put them on the website. We can talk with people. But if you also just need some ideas about how to get going and just are looking for some supportive aspects like that, that is also fantastic. And that is also something that we would be more than happy to help with. And so it's really a very relaxed process in that sense. And with that, I really want to just take some time to thank the different groups that we've been a part of. Our group leaders have been massively supportive of us taking the time to address this initiative and come up with all of these ideas, and it would have been much more difficult without their support. And so we're very grateful for that, as well as to all the different people who have really worked very hard in the past year to make all of this happen. And so if you guys do have questions, you can of course email us. We have an official email, info@greenlabsaustria.at. And we also try to spread a lot of the information about what we're doing and who we're doing it with through our Twitter account @greenlabsaustria. And so that's also a great way to kind of stay up to date with what we're doing. And with that, this is just kind of the team, a recent picture that we took, the ones who have really put in all of the hard work and effort. And at this point, I think we'd just like to open it up for questions or discussion or concerns, anything that you guys have that you might want to ask about. We'd be more than happy to try to answer that. And again, thank you for letting us come talk to you guys about this.